Hello! So today I'm here to talk about the books that I read in the first half of April. If you want to know about the audiobooks I've been listening to this month, I did say in my last wrap up, I think I'm going to start doing audiobooks in a separate wrap up because the two wrap ups that I do a month were getting insanely long. So I was doing about 40 minutes of wrap up all told, which is too long for you guys, I understand. So it was taking me an awful long time to edit them. So audiobooks are not going to be included in this wrap up, they are going to come at the end of the month. So if you're interested in those, please keep an eye out, they are on their way. It's just coming later. So this is just the physical books that I read in the first half of the month. And I've got to be honest, it hasn't gone amazingly well. I think I kind of went into the month feeling kind of casual and like I'm doing well with my reading goals, and I've been reading a lot of books recently, so I kind of went into the first half of the month not putting too much pressure on myself, and as a result I haven't got much read. But I've still got 4 things to talk to you about, and let's get straight into it. The first thing I read was Boris Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago. I firstly found this in a charity shop for 50p, and I really love this little edition. I don't know, it's just really nice size to hold, it's really sweet, and it's really easy to carry around. I think this book is a lot of the reason that I was a bit slower in this half of the month. This took me over a week to get through in the end. Admittedly, I was doing other things during that week, so reading wasn't a priority, but this did take quite a long time. I think it's deceptive because I've got this little edition. It looks like it's quite small and that it's not going to take very long, but the pages are Bible thin and there is a lot of writing to a page, so it's actually quite a thick book. So that was one thing that I sort of went into it thinking it would be relatively fast, and it really wasn't. This is set in the Russian Revolution, and although we sort of fracture off into different characters throughout, we predominantly follow a man called Zhivago, Yuri Zhivago. The book starts with his mother dying and then his father committing suicide when he's quite young, and it kind of spans over his whole lifetime, and he goes off to war and things like that, but predominantly this focuses on the Russian Revolution and Yuri's experiences in the Russian Revolution. I knew next to nothing about the Russian Revolution going into this. Luckily for me, I've got a partner who knows everything that's everything in the world of history, so every time I wasn't sure what was going on, or you know what was actually happening, I could just ask him and he'd sort of give me a bit of the history, which helped me to understand this. I would still say I would have enjoyed this a lot more if I knew more about the Russian Revolution, purely because it is quite heavy on the history side of things, which I didn't know going into it. I think it's very much marketed as a romance, and the romance in this is probably the best I have ever read. It's the best written romantic scenes, but I wouldn't say that that is a leading part of the story in the slightest. Out of the 400 odd pages in this copy, probably about 50 of them were based on the romance, so you know, to market it as a romance, which I think the film definitely is marketed as a romance, I think is really doing it an injustice. It's very much about the revolution and the history and the atmosphere in Russia at the time, but I think my main confusion with it was that I couldn't quite grasp what side Zhivago was on. I think the whole point of this is that his loyalty shifts quite a lot. He's from a wealthy family, so they're naturally sort of shunned by the Red Party or the rebels, but I think he has a lot of sympathy for the rebels, especially after his experiences in the war. Then I think he experiences things which make him question that again, so I think that's where I mainly got confused, was like I couldn't quite grasp, because I didn't fully know the history of it, I couldn't quite grasp what was happening at what time. But other than that, I would really recommend this. If you're willing to do a little bit of backstory and a little bit of research, this is a fantastic, fantastic book. I've read a few Russian classics now and I've really enjoyed all of them. There's something very morose about Russian classic writers. There's something very deep and dark and brooding, and you know, it's all quite melodramatic, but I think, and we'll come to this later on in another book, I quite enjoy melodrama in my literature, as long as it's not ridiculous. But like, you know, in Russian novels that I've read, if somebody's unhappy, they'll just grab a gun and threaten to shoot themselves, and I don't know, that just satisfies me. I enjoy it when that happens, and I thoroughly enjoyed this. The writing is phenomenal, and as I say, the romantic scenes, though they're not a leading part of the story in the slightest, are amazingly written. They are so thoroughly romantic. I was blown away by the quality. There's nothing cheesy or overblown about the romance. It's kind of understated but just so impactfully romantic, and oh, so good. I would definitely recommend. It's a bit of a slog, and there were times when I was slightly bored, but when I actually sat down and dedicated large chunks of time to this, I thoroughly enjoyed it and I would recommend. Then after reading that pretty heavy book, I decided to pick up something that I knew would be a bit lighter, so I picked up the Lola Quartet by Emily St John Mandel, mainly because it's short and I knew it would be quite an easy read. I have mixed feelings about this. I did not like it, and it definitely satisfied my desire for an easy read, but I wouldn't say that this is a story that's going to particularly stick with me. So again, we follow a few different characters in this book, but we predominantly follow a man called Gavin, who is, when we meet him, a newspaper reporter in New York. We know that his wife has left him, or was she his fiance or something? I think she was his wife. Has recently left him, kind of starting to struggle a bit in just his daily life. He goes back to see his sister, who gives him a photo of a girl who looks a lot like her and has the surname of a girlfriend that he had when he was at school. And obviously he assumes it's his child, and the story basically flashes around the characters that were in this band that Gavin was in at college. And it flashes through what happened to all of them, and what part they played in the story of this little girl, and also the story of his girlfriend who left without saying anything. He just assumed that she'd gone off to live with an aunt because that was sort of the story that was put around, but it was a bit more to it than that. And it kind of ends up being a bit of a mystery and a bit of a sort of detective story in a way. Yeah, as I say, I liked it. I liked the reading experience. It was really fast to read, and though I did find the writing a little bit clunky to start with, there were some sentences that I had to read quite a lot of times to fully grasp what they were saying, just from bad wording or bad punctuation, I don't know. But that definitely got better as the story went on. I sadly wouldn't say that this is a standout book for me, but it's certainly a book worth reading, especially I think if you've enjoyed Station 11. I would say obviously Station 11 is the book that she's known for, and I think it's definitely much more impactful than this story, but it was pleasant, it was fine. Then I read The Birds and Other Stories by Daphne du Maurier. I feel like I've done this book an injustice because I only gave it 3 stars, and from looking at the reviews, everyone else loved it. But it just didn't really sit with me. I don't think it was my personal taste. It's not that it's a bad book in any way at all. It just didn't suit what I like in a collection of stories. So obviously this has got The Birds in it, which is very famously the basis for the film The Birds, and that was fine. I kind of felt like it was a little bit strange, and I didn't particularly care about the sort of plot of it, but it was fine. And then there's a story in here that I really didn't like, and actually this is probably one of the longest stories in the collection. Let me just check. It's called Montverita, and it was so boring. I was having to force myself to read it, and it was about 50 pages long. That's another thing, and I think probably the main reason that I didn't get on with this collection that well. The stories for the most part are very long. The Birds itself I think was 40 pages, Montverita was 50, and the next story after that was also 50. Admittedly, after The Birds and Montverita I did enjoy the stories a lot more, but because I didn't like those 2 first stories that much, especially the second one, I really disliked it. There were no stories at the end that really stood out for me. I think that's the thing. Like, I know that I'm going to think back on this collection and just not be able to actually call to mind any of the stories particularly. There was a story at the end that I quite liked, which was a lot shorter. It was called The Old Man. I really liked the twist at the end of that. Obviously, du Maurier's writing is good. She's a very good writer. This is the second of hers that I've read after Rebecca. I do intend to pick up more of her, though. I don't know that I'll particularly be seeking out her short stories. As I say, me and longer short stories don't get on. I kind of like stories with a punch. I like them to be impactful and short and compacted, and these are not. They're quite long, and as I say, they can get a little bit tedious and boring at places. Yeah, it just wasn't for me, sadly. It just was not for me. But as I say, I will definitely be carrying on with her, and I don't hold it against her as a writer, and I don't think it's particularly a fair representation because I just don't think it's a book that suited me. Then I finished with one of these little Penguin modern editions that are floating around at the moment and are only £1, and this is Dorothy Parker's The Custard Heart. Now, I Dorothy Parker is a name that I know, but I've never really known what she's written or looked out for her fiction, but the Custard Heart, the title, really captured me, and there's a little quote on the very inside of this. She felt a cosy solidarity with the big company of the voluntary dead. So that kind of sold me, and it was only £1, and I think this is what's great about these little books. They've got a few short stories in them or a few essays, and they kind of give you a cheap way to taste an author before you buy a full-length book. I think they're all 50 pages long. So, you know, I thought I would give this a go, and it was the only one that really stood out for me. And I am so glad I did. I adored this. Like, if it was longer, I would have given it 5 stars without a hesitation. Although it's not on Goodreads actually, so I couldn't give it any stars, but if it was longer I would have definitely given it 5 stars. As it is, it could only really be a 4-star because there are only 3 stories in here. Actually, the Custard Heart is not the longest story. There is a story that pretty much takes up most of this collection. It's about 35 pages long, that is called Big Blonde, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Going back to what I said about melodrama and liking melodrama in my fiction, and especially my short stories, these are very melodramatic. So the Custard Heart and Big Blonde both focus on women who are suffering some sort of mental distress, and I thoroughly enjoyed Big Blonde so much. I loved it. It's been a long time since I've read a short story and put it down and thought I really liked that a lot. But it was it just completely appealed to my own personal taste. I don't think that this is probably for everyone. I think if you don't like melodrama in your stories, you won't like these. It's not particularly covered over that it's a bit melodramatic. But the thing is, the writing is really stunning, and I think the themes are really fantastic. For example, going back to Big Blonde, just because it's the longest one, the Custard Heart and the story at the end are fantastic as well, but they were quite short, so they didn't explore themes as in depth. But in Big Blonde, it's very much about this idea of the fact that people are happier to see you happy, and they don't want to know if you're feeling depressed, you know, and she's having these real issues with depression, and she's trying to reach out and talk to people, and they're just putting more drinks in her hand and sort of creating an alcohol problem, because they're just saying, drink that and be happy and have a good time. And she's trying to say, you know, I'm not happy, I'm struggling. And I think that's such a timely message, especially given that these stories were written in the 1940s. I just, yeah, loved it. I'm definitely going to be seeking out more Dorothy Parker. I think she's right up my street. So that's everything I read for the first half of the month. Not as much as I've been reading in recent months, but I'm still kind of happy with it. Anyway, let me know down below what you've been reading in the first half of the month, and I will see you next time. Bye!